So anyway, welcome everybody. I'm glad
Yeah.
you're here. We've just been kind of riffing, which is fine. I mean, this is fine. There's no set thing here, but I mostly just wanted to provide an opportunity for people to meet Paul. Paul and I've had a couple of. This is our second time that we've met on Zoom, and we both share a passion for music software, and I've been just incredibly appreciative of the abcjs and what I've been able to do with it. And I thought maybe others would be interested in. The first question that I would have is, Paul, is like, why?
Yeah.
Why
Well,
did you
it,
do what? Why
yeah.
did you do this in the first place?
Well,
When did you get started, and why did you do it?
yeah. Well, I got started. I mean, I sort of was playing with this, decades ago, even not on the web, before web, and just kind of playing around with stuff and just seeing what was around to make sheet music. And so I kind of found early, like, first of all, it sounds really easy, like, oh, it's just 5 lines and you draw circles on them. It's like it doesn't seem like but then you start getting more involved and you see like it's an endless process. But when you start out, it doesn't seem that hard. So it's kind of like a nice weekend project. But then I started getting into the web, and this was back in 2008. And this was before, like, IE did not have SVG. And so I was just trying to figure out, how do you do this with divs and borders and just isolate pictures. And it was just kind of, it was a, like, I sort of proved that the concept would work, but it was also really clunky, and I don't think it would scale very well. And right at the same time, this guy Gregory Dyke posted to the ABC list about, you know having an idea for, basically the exact same idea as me, which is like doing, ABC, translating it in JavaScript to the browser. And so we just started talking, and then it got to be kind of fun. And it's one of those things. I saw a great inspirational poster, which I loved, and it said, "We do it not because it's easy, but because we thought it would be easy." And so I kind of, it just felt like it just sort of, once it snowballs, it was just interesting. We kept going on it, but then Gregory was like, he went to grad school, got a PhD and everything. And after that, even during all that, he was working on it. But once he got out in the real world, he really hasn't had time for it. So I've been pretty much the only main maintainer since then. But so then this continued being a hobby, and people were using it, and a company picked it up, and I started doing features for them, and I started consulting for them, and now I'm working for them. So the project turned into a full-time job, but
Fantastic.
it really was a weekend project to start.
When was like the 1.0 release? When did you first let the world know about it?
Let's see. I think it was probably 2009. I'm trying to think. So I mean, I guess what you would call, like, we didn't really do Simverse back then particularly, but I think when Gregory had talked to what's his name, Jeremy, from the session,
Mm-hmm.
and
Jeremy
Jeremy
Reed. Yeah.
put the library on the session, and I think that was the first time it was ever actually used
Oh wow.
by anybody outside of us that we know of, and so I think that was about 2009, perhaps 2010, but I don't really remember exactly when. But it supported IE6. I remember that we supported IE6 way, way, way long time. So way past when we probably needed to. But like, I see, like, from my work and from what Jeremy said, is that people hit these sites in really terrible browsers.
Yes.
I mean, it's stunning, like, what the the browser list is that we get in our logs. It's so you can't say, oh, well, all modern browsers do this. It's like, well, yes, some people have a really old iPads,
Yeah.
and they still work just fine. So they want to be able to use websites.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me. I was trying it on I had a Samsung Galaxy Tab. Well, I think we talked about this, and it's got to be 10 plus years old at least, you know, and it was able to run abcjs stuff just fine and
Yeah,
fast, which
yeah,
kind of blew my mind, you know, that it was like, wow, even back then.
yeah. Well, I have like an old Galaxy tablet too, and like even if you go to like DuckDuckGo and you touch a result, it takes like 3 seconds to see if you even touched it right. You know, it just like is so slow. But yeah, I'm running charts on that, and in fact, that's what I use on stage. You know, and it works just fine. You can go between tunes all you want, transpose. You know, whatever you need to do.
It's interesting looking at the logs because I've got Google Analytics on every feature in my tool just to kind of tell me what people are interested in. And I find that the most common thing people are doing with it is transposing. Like that's the action I see the most of. And I don't know if it's
Yeah,
just because they're playing with it because they're like, oh, that's what's oh,
yeah,
because it is
yeah,
kind of
yeah.
it is cool to watch it
Yeah.
happen. But
Well, in my tool, I don't know if you count this, but in my tool, like you hit up, down, it goes half steps. So I
yeah,
don't know if somebody wants to transpose like a fifth, they go pop, 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 and that counts as 7 transpose.
okay.
So I don't
I
know if
have
you do that.
Yeah, well, I have. So if you click on my transpose does a half step. If you shift click, it does a full step, and if you alt click, it does an octave.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
um,
Which probably nobody knows about.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I
Yeah.
have tool tips on things, and no one looks at them.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's hard to get like I mean I that's how I am. Like what's the minimum I need to know about this software to get my
Yeah,
work done? Even
yeah.
if it takes extra clicks, I don't care, you know, then I don't have to learn something when I'm trying to do my job. But but yeah, so that but yeah, so it's been I've been trying to make sure that it stays compatible with older browsers as much as possible. And so there's when I added the sound, of course, takes a newer browser technology. So now there's 2 levels. If you don't have sound, I can support these. If you do have sound, it's just slightly later. But now at
Nice.
this point, it might be a moot point because I don't know if IE 11 is even, you know, like well so that's the thing is we have to support really old Safari because people always have old iPads, but I don't know that anybody is still running things that use IE11. We haven't seen that in a while, and in fact for my work we disallow that and we haven't had any problems.
Yeah,
We disallowed it over
we
a
cut
year
away
ago.
from it. The company that I retired from,
Yeah.
we finally. I mean, we had because our product, we took a Windows graphics editing system and we ported it Windows based and we ported it to the web, and we had to support IE 11 for the first 5 years of that product, and I think we only abandoned it maybe 3 years ago.
Mhm.
And yeah, it was an enormous pain in the ass to have
Yeah.
to support it. We couldn't use any modern JavaScript, you know. We couldn't
Yeah.
use it was, but
Yeah.
now that we're kind of now,
Well,
well, I'm not there anymore. But you know, when we were finally freed from it, it just made things so much easier.
yeah, so that's something I'm struggling with now. Like I'd love to do modernize some of the JavaScript in the actual project, but it all works. So is there an advantage to modernizing other than it looks cleaner? And I guess the big advantage is then I can get more people to help me work on it because I think people will go in and look at it and say, "Oh, I'm not going to work on old common JS with vars." You know, it's like that's not what I do normally, you know. But so yeah, so I think it could use a lot of modernization, but that stuff I think will always work. I don't think it'll ever stop working.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, that's definitely a goal to someday, you know, get a little bit more modern. But though it's so risky, like so it's like you make things nice for the developer, and then suddenly there's all these browsers that can't use it anymore, you know, but then maybe all those browsers is like 2 people, you know,
Yeah.
because you know, you did,
And
yeah,
it's very different, I think, if it's a commercial product like what you're doing versus a hobby product like I'm doing. Like it's like
yeah,
if it doesn't work on IE 11, I like
yeah,
sorry, you know, spend a hundred
yeah,
dollars and buy a used iPad. You know, I mean,
yeah,
I'm not actively, you know, I tested on what I have available, which is a whole
yeah,
pile of iPads, iPhones, and
yeah.
in all the browsers that I have on my Mac here. But yeah, as a commercial entity, of course, your priorities are going to have to be very different, I would think.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, that commercial thing, but then also for the library, because I want like, I want people to use it and I don't want anybody to say, well, I can't use it because I'm supporting I-11. Now, of course, hopefully they're not going to say that anymore, but
Yeah.
if the Safari 9, maybe, it's
Mhm.
like, I mean, that's just kind of like, and I've read a lot of articles. A lot of people are struggling with this in general. Excuse me, with libraries. Right now it's like, do we just go all modern JavaScript? And it's like everybody wants to, but
Yeah. I think one of the main advantages might be is, and I think, I just based on the kind of warnings I'm seeing in the console on Chrome is, they're getting a little bit more crazy about how long things take. And,
Mhm.
and so I'll often see like, these warnings that say, oh, the callback from this set timeout took, 536 milliseconds or
Mhm.
whatever. And
Yeah,
I think moving to, because they're looking at how long you can actually hold you can hold the main UI thread, and and so, I've tried to do more things with async and promises and that sort of
Mhm.
stuff where appropriate, because like a lot of, for
Yeah,
example, like the QR code generation stuff is all async,
yeah,
and I can't just say, go give me a QR code and then you just go get it.
Mhm.
I have to write my whole thing around sort of an async structure. And I'm doing it using callbacks right now just because, you know, and, but but I did have some situations where, for example, like in abcjs, so maybe one of the things, I was working with very large tune books, 200 tunes, let's say. And, I stamp out all the divs, and then I would throw the whole thing at abcjs, and it would render it. But it does it all synchronously, right?
Mhm.
And, and so I put up a spinner before, and when it's done, I take the spinner down, and that kind of thing. And so, and so I'm thinking there may be opportunities to provide, and maybe they already exist, and I just don't know about them. For
Actually, no, that they don't, but that gives me the idea. Mostly I do one tune, and so I don't really see that problem much. Or if I do more than one tune, it's a dozen.
yeah,
But that wouldn't be a bad idea to do each tune asynchronously, or
yeah,
at least have a call for that. So I mean, that's a great idea, and it
yeah, do
wouldn't
it
be hard to do
asynchronously.
it all.
The other thing that would be very interesting is I thought about doing kind of lazy rendering, where I can look at the divs that are visible
Yeah,
and only render tunes, kind of on the fly,
yeah,
and that would,
yeah,
because like the only reason I don't do it now is that I find that on most modern computers, right in the built in the last 5-10 years, that it takes it like I can do 100 tunes and it renders the whole thing in a few seconds.
mm,
And the ton of tune books that people are doing, 100 tunes that's a pretty big tune book. Most locals, I
yeah,
mean, so I haven't really focused too much on the performance of the div rendering optimization, because that's a pretty challenging problem to
yeah.
solve.
Yeah.
But
So what I do, I mean, generally what I do is I
yeah,
have like one tune per page. So
yeah,
it's a tune book, but you're only putting one tune up. But yeah, that's a problem too, is like SVG, each part of the SVG is an element. And you have a limited number of elements you can put in the browser before it bogs down the DOM.
yeah, and it's surprising how high that number is actually. I'm finding, but I was thinking, for example, if one thing, for example, to make it easier so for example, for me to do a lazy loading system, I have to keep track of the divs, I have to keep track of the visibility, but maybe it might be interesting at the abcjs level that says basically, when you go to render in the div, if the div isn't there, you simply don't render it. Although
Mhm.
that doesn't work. Here's the reason why it doesn't work all the time, is because when I go to render my tune books, I scrape the DOM, and I rasterize it into bitmaps and I stamp them into a PDF. And so that's a case where I'd have to basically say force render. But I could see some optimizations at the library level that might allow for lazy rendering when desired, but complete total rendering when you actually need all the elements populated. Something like that, to handle some of these large cases. Although they are kind of in the weeds, to be honest. I do them as technology demos mostly, just to kind of show that it's capable of that the browsers, that
Yeah.
there's something about creating, a 200 tune PDF tune book with notation on your phone. That's a really great tech demo, both of what's possible in a browser and the robustness of abcjs. That just, so.
Yeah. Well,
But just
does anyone have questions in general? Like I'm sort of curious about what other people's interests are.
Gary, Pascal, Tina, questions? Sorry.
I'm almost feeling a duty bound to come up with one. One of
Yeah.
my main interests in what Michael's done is the analytic facility, the ability to. I do an awful lot of trying to figure out how best to transcribe the way Irish musicians ornament stuff, to be able, not as a didactic device, but simply to come to terms with the differences. What are the boundaries? When is it no longer sound Irish and some guy from Brooklyn playing a tin whistle? And Michael's tweaks, just all of the swing quantification is
Yeah.
really, really useful in doing that. So I don't generate tune books. I mean, I'm way beyond anything other than tending to my own edification and gratification with all of this. But when you designed this stuff, Paul, did you ever have a thought towards what it was capable of doing?
I
I'm
think,
sorry, that
yeah.
sounds way wrong.
Yeah, no,
Yeah,
I know what you're saying, but
yeah.
really I'm thinking that I didn't have a whole lot of thought beyond what I was actually doing myself. Like it's like I wanted to put a tune on the screen or even just part of it. Like I wanted to be able to talk about a tune and like, well, right inside a paragraph, put two measures that that are just one musical concept or something about it. And so I just wanted to just, have a way to not to be able to just type in something and have it show up as notation. And for me, in fact, at the beginning, we had no plans for audio at all. And then we kind of like put something really simple in just as a basically proofreading. It's like, well, you type it in, did I get it right? Well, let me play back the MIDI and see if it plays right. And it wasn't supposed to sound good. It wasn't supposed to do anything. But then everybody asked for it. And that's the thing, is like, especially with these tune books, like people just start asking for stuff. And it's like, oh yeah, that's just one more feature and we could do this whole other thing. And so yeah, there was definitely grew. There was no plan at the beginning at all.
Is there something intrinsic to the code base that you initially amassed that makes it amenable to this sort of day by day user steered
Yeah.
add-ons? Or
Well, you try. Like I feel like, like I've done lots of stuff over my career, and you try to think in advance, how do I make this easy to change? Because that's the basic thing. Software is going to change, and how easy it is to change software is how good it is. It's like, can I add something to it? Can I change this without really messing up everything? And you're always wrong. I mean, it's like, in all these decades, I've never really got that line correct. But a couple of things that I feel like went right with the ABCJS, which is partly from doing it with a partner, is we kind of each took one side. Like I took the parsing side he took the rendering side. And so then we said, okay, so if we're doing that, we need an API. And so I spent a bit of time creating the structure and creating a tool to make sure that structure was always consistent. So like, I wouldn't have to worry what he's doing. I could add features and then they would appear in the structure. He doesn't have to worry what I'm doing. He can, either mock that structure or, just wait for me to do it. And then he can, so we split the problem in half. And that was a good place to split the problem. And in fact, I kind of thinking like ABC is great. I mean, it's nice, does what it does, but it's not the only way to do music. Like we were talking a little bit before the Zoom about like, taking MIDI and creating sheet music. Well, the MIDI could, instead of going MIDI to ABC to rendering, it could just go MIDI to rendering because the MIDI could create that exact same structure. And so like, as when you modularize stuff like that, you create all these other things. And also you can go from parsing then to the audio. So having parsing be a separate thing, you could replace the parser and you can replace the type of output. So
it's like the music XML import that I brought in. Just another representation that seems to have a very, very nice one-to-one mapping with ABC.
Yeah,
it was
yeah, it's
amazing to me.
almost. I mean, like I tried to do that before
close
too,
enough,
and well, it's easier to go like you could take ABC and create music XML a lot easier than the other way around.
Sure. But considering I've been throwing just hundreds of, I just go ahead and scrape the web for like these repositories of classical music and in music XML format, and I'll just bring it into abcjs, do the transform. And I tell you, what I get looks amazing and it plays back perfectly. And, whether or not it actually, brings across every nuance, of course not, but that it works at all and doesn't crash and sounds and looks right is kind of mind blowing to me.
Yeah.
That it completely transformed my perception of what ABC was. And I kind of went on a mission of showing people that like this is a lot more than just for your little 8 measures of reel or jig. This thing can do some pretty rich stuff. And it was a real eye opener. There was a question about the oh shoot, you were talking, you're talking, Carrie, about the representation of Irish music. So the two things that I was focused on was to try to make the rendering of Irish music in ABC sound more authentic. And that ended up being two basic concepts, which was that you mentioned swing, and the second one was ornamentation, was roll rendering, and swing, and and I think I've got a pretty nice solution in there now that that I feel like sounds better than anything else that's at least been on the web. I'm sure that some of the dedicated software has got some microcontrols of that kind of stuff. And but what was interesting about it was that I didn't have to add anything to abcjs itself to make those things happen. Those constructs were already there in the code in some form. So, for example, there was already, it looked like you had a prototypical swing implementation that was kind of something you were playing with. And I saw where you were using it, and I just expanded on what was there and added my own, sort of opt-in version of, and, and does it work in all cases? Probably not. I'm quite sure it doesn't. But, I looked at it and I said, well, here's the way that Irish music is generally structured. It's generally focused around eighth notes. They're in these combinations. Where is the swing mostly applied? Let's solve that particular case. So at least Irish music, because that's again my focus, would sound good, particularly with hornpipes. Like hornpipes in general, like that's the biggest problem is hornpipes are always played straight by most players. I thought it'd really be nice if we just knew that this was a hornpipe and just swung it and have some control of the swing. And that was a relatively simple one. That was just a matter of sort of taking pairs of notes and, and putting more on one versus the other and being able to control that and figuring out where to do that and how to sync it all up to the playback. Relatively straightforward. And then put an API on top of that to be able to do that from inside the ABC. But kind of talking to what Carrie's talking about, like doing the analysis of how to control the timing, the micro timing of rolls was fascinating. And again, this is nothing that I didn't have to add anything to abcjs to do it. There was already a roll implementation, a default roll implementation for the ornament. There's a whole bunch of ability in abcjs based on symbols before notes to say basically this symbol will have some effect on the playback, and then there's like a little piece of code that generates the notes for that particular. It basically says here's the note. Here's the original note that was that was there. It's a G and it's a quarter note, and now you get to do something else. You can say, I'm going to replace that with, these 4 notes, and they're going to have this particular timing, and it's up to you to make sure you don't screw up the overall timing of the thing. But and there was like a very clear, distinct, like right there. That's where I need to put this code. Now what? How? Now, okay, I know where to put the code, and the question is like, how do you, what are the elements of what makes a roll in Irish music sound like, and it's very context dependent. Like rolls in jigs have different timing feel, have a different swing to them than rolls in reels, and sometimes they're front heavy and sometimes they're back heavy and sometimes they're delayed. And how do you represent that in a way that you can generalize in some format based on the tune type and on the combinations? And and it was the analysis part of it. Again, this abcjs had all the capability, but the higher level analysis of like, well, what are the structures that are common in Irish music that that where the roll the roll execution needs to sort of know, has to have context in order to be able to do it correctly. And how do you, and it turns out that there really are only 2, if you solve it for 2 common structures, which is for the quarter note and for the dotted quarter note, you can, and then have some defaults and have the ability to override that on a per tune basis, you can create something that really sounds nice. So deconstructing the roll problem, was fascinating. And again, it wasn't so much about abcjs. abcjs could do it. The question was, what did I want it to do?
Yeah, and that's actually
that's really fun.
Yeah, it's kind of a problem too, because different kinds of music have different
exactly
solutions to that, or like especially like grace notes. Like I once tried to go in and try to make the grace notes work better. And it's just like, it just depends on the kind of music. There's just no.
Yeah, does it land, like in Irish music, does the grace note land, does the destination, can I describe it? Does the note you're gracing to land on the beat, or does the grace take away from the beat? And it's going to be totally dependent. And I know she had like stuff in there for like bagpipe ornamentation. It's a really hard problem to solve in the general case, isn't it?
But I've been looking at the historical record on all of this, and this is traceable. I mean, how are people playing roll-like constructs from the middle of the 16th century? And there's this constant thing. The current big name Irish people will say that under no circumstances do you take anything from the beat for your ornament. And then when you listen to what they're doing, that's exactly what they're doing. They're taking from the beat. And the other is, do we take it from the note before? If one takes this dictum that the grace note, the cut, the tap, is supposed to be so brief that you cannot determine its pitch. If you have a really good ear, you can tell if it's above or below. Well, in that case, I suppose there's a very elegant integral equation for all of this. In that case, it's really moot. You are taking it from what could as easily be the beat or the note before, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
But in fact, it does matter, because if you listen to say, Leo Rosen's early recordings, he's playing a role as two ornaments, the one of which attaches to the note before and the other attaches to the note after. And it's not infinitesimally brief. You can hear the pitches of every single one of those 5 notes. And I noted, when I was busy appreciating Michael's efforts here, that he said that one of the problems he had was that the code permitted him to do all sorts of stuff except for what he just said, and that's move the note into the time space of the grace note into the time space before it. And that's you, Paul. I mean, is this the kind of thing that you could easily regard as an incremental tweak so that Michael could do what a guy like me would love to be able to have software to support?
Well, you can actually do that. Like, so basically, when there's a intermediate, like, so I have, like, you put the tune through and you create that structure I said, and then you take that structure and you can create the MIDI. But as soon as there's an intermediate of taking, like, here's the abstract music, let me turn that into a number of events. Like, this note starts at this millisecond, this note starts at that millisecond. So you have this set of events, but before then you take those events and actually create the MIDI, the actual sound. But there's a place where you can call out of abcjs there, and you can say, well, here's the list of events. You want to do something with them? And then it's just a matter of, like, oh, well, here's the event that ends with this measure. Let me shorten that a little bit, and let me put, like, the grace note in there. So you can easily go through that and analyze it. So then once you can do that, you can also write a little routine to do that, so that you can generically say, well, here's the grace note, so let me do that every place this grace note appears. And so so that I when you talk about extensibility, that's one of those things that I feel like that's a really good extensibility point, where there's a bit of a hard part. Like, we were also talking before the Zoom about what the difference between what you see on the music and what actually sounds is, like, a lot larger than you think. It's such a convention. But, like, translating what you see on the page to actual, here, this note happens here and this note happens there, I can do that part and nobody has to think about that. And hopefully that's done correctly. And but then once you get to that point, you can do any tweak you want. You can change the swing, you can change whatever you need to. So
so the thing that's interesting, though, is when I did my modifications, I did them inside abcjs because, for example, I would have to, in order to, for example, okay, so, like, I'm looking at the particular event, and I could look at the adjacent events and do I could sort of zoom out and do a bigger sort of meta thing. Again, I was just trying to start out doing something as, like, oh, I wonder if I could do this, right? And so that's how these things start. They start simple and then expand. But, like, for example, I actually, I wasn't aware of the fact that there was a place where I could get all the events in my code rather than having to modify abcjs. But the thing is, I needed to know specifically at that point that, like my code changes for the roles are in the, what you have is there is the Irish role implementation that gets called when that ornament's detected, for that thing to generate the series of events for that ornament. And that kind of meta information, I would have to figure out on my own if all I got was the event stream, right? I'd have to figure out, oh, that's that note, and it's got a tilde before it, and I have to now correlate that back to the letters and find the event.
But it does have the start and end characters.
It does have the start and end characters. That's right, because I'm using that now. Yeah.
And so in theory, so basically, I don't pass the string through, but you probably have it. You probably have it, like, one line of code above where you called it, because you just did the render. So I mean, that was kind of the point of having start and end character. So for each of those events, you have a start and end character. So you can always go back if you have to do something funny and, like, go back and see what was written there. So
I've started playing around with that in the what was it that I had to do recently where I had to pass all that down? There was, oh, when I was doing my when I was doing the solfege, yeah, I needed actually at the audio render time, I needed to know the start and end characters because I needed to be able to correlate at sample selection time the note that was going to be loaded against the actual note that was in the ABC so that I could do sample replacement. So I'm starting to get more familiar with that part of it. But yeah, Carrie, I think essentially, you know, what we're saying is like anything's possible. The pieces are there. The bigger problem is
Well, it's
figuring, yeah,
the problem from my perspective is how daunting the tweak needs to be. I mean, there's obviously room for a shim between the end of event A and the beginning of event B. But is it glaringly enough obvious for it to be comfortable enough for someone who's interested in implementing, I don't know what you would call it, second level events, subsidiary
yeah,
events, so that you have an event and then you have a gap, you have to, that's an attribute of musicality, the difference between what you see on the page and what you're actually doing to be a musician. And that's regarded as silence, which has very clear semantics, but we're violating those semantics. No, it's not silence. It's an active silence. And yes, there is room for and the hooks necessary to be able to do stuff in that act to activate that silence. But is Michael going to end up doing it? So, and am I going to be able to feel great about the fact that we had this conversation and look at the upshot?
yeah. So, I mean, all the information is there, right? I mean, this stream of events tells you, you know, essentially what the note is, where it starts in time, what its duration is, and information that allows you to correlate it back to the original ABC stream in case you need to do some reverse analysis. My sense is that, you know, probably how can I describe it? So for me, like the biggest challenge has not been so much in, and this goes back to what we were talking about, people don't read anything. It hasn't been, it's been trying to understand the overall structure and flow of abcjs to know to know how and where to hook things. And, and part of the beauty and the horror of open source stuff is that I can hack away like crazy at the code to make it do what I want to do. And sometimes that makes it, some of the things I do are really easy to port back to the project, and some of the things I have are ugly and horrible and embarrassing, but they work. And a lot of things I've been doing more recently, I've been in the ugly, embarrassing, but work phase, and I need to probably figure out a way that fits in better into the sort of hierarchy of the structure to make some of these things easier to port back. But the same problem is that because I like I wasn't aware of this intermediate stream capability, and because my stuff is now deeply integrated into my custom version of abcjs, my solution is not, for example, my general solution for swing, my general solution for custom roll timing, I even have like custom rhythm patterns, because I literally get people, I swear to God, this is crazy. I have a guy who sends me arrangements in 2216, and he says, "Can you get?" And it goes like 3 3 3 3 2 2 2 2 3 2 2 2 3 3 2, and I want the backup beats to match up with that, and I can do that, you know, and probably you can do it with ABC in general, but I, you know, so I have like ability to do these custom rhythm patterns and stuff like that, and but the way that I do it, I look and I go, okay, this works for me, and I'm happy to ship this, and you know, again, it's a hobby, but I look and I go, I don't think this is commercially shippable. I think this is too much of a hack. You know, I mean,
Yeah,
some of the
but
things,
I could also lead you in the right direction. Like, you know, if we, you know, kind of collaborate on some of
yeah,
those things, I can get you to put the things in the right place. And you
right,
like, well, for instance, for the swing, I'd love to get the swing back in there. And so if you just even tell me the algorithm that you're using to do the swing, which I
yeah.
think I kind of got, like you have one for eighth notes and one for quarter notes, right? Or
That's for the rolls.
oh,
I'd have to look at it, but no,
yeah,
my swing solution is exactly where yours was. So that one's
okay.
just a matter of
Because
looking how I did it.
what well, mine, like I didn't really, I can't remember what it was, but I tried to use that for my jazz charts and they didn't sound right.
Yeah.
And so and then I
Mine actually
stopped
has to be,
working with it.
mine is meter adaptive. So
Yeah,
it figures out based on the meter, it has different algorithms it uses versus for jigs
yeah,
versus polkas versus reels. It has
yeah.
a slightly different feel to it.
Hmm. Yeah,
Um,
but I mean, I'd like to actually get that in the product because that's something that would really, that's something that I would use a lot. Like we have our charts that also you can play the MIDI for. So, and then the whole different kind of backups. Like I really want to implement all that. Like,
yes.
in other words, just like sock chords versus like the boom chick, versus, whatever else you want, like even like, you know, three sock chords and a rest, three sock chords and a rest, something like that, like all these different rhythms that you actually see in practice.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
uh
that's what I did with
yeah,
my custom rhythm patterns is I had the I wanted something beyond
okay.
the basic boom chick for the and this all happened because I started getting requests for sevens and nines and 11s and 13s and stuff like that. And and so yeah, that would be great. I would love to see more extension on the and some kind of easy third party extension to the backup system in in a standard way rather than in my sort of backdoor way that I did it with my
Mhm.
custom boom
Yeah.
chip.
Well, so here's another thing that's sort of like a little complicated is there's all these, we have the basic ABC, then we have everybody who writes a tool gets a request to do some kind of feature and they kind of write their own. There's not been a standard of how these kind of things work, but there are tools that have implemented some things. And so it's like if somebody came up with something, even if it isn't like the syntax I would like, if it at least works, then I want to not have a competing syntax. And so I want to look at the existing prior art and see, if there's a way people have expressed it. And I know that there's Phil Taylor did some work with all that at some point. And I don't know how good it is, if it's totally usable, for our purposes, but it seems like maybe using their syntax, start with like that's the syntax um, that will express this,
Right.
and then go from there. But I've also noticed that sometimes that doesn't work. It's like that. It's not. You know, I wish that instead of just sort of like, oh, I need this feature, let me just throw this in there without thinking about the ramifications. This will work for Irish music, but then there's all these things that are inconsistent, and
Yeah.
like all these things that you can't put these two parameters in at the same time because they'll conflict. Nobody thought of that in advance. And I really kind of wanted to have like a little standards committee, just like just a informal mailing list where
Yeah.
you could talk about this and talk about like, what are all the comment directives, and you know here's a common problem. So like a really common problem is you have like the eighth measure in jazz. Like, so your key of G or something, you'll have like a whole note, G note, but the chords will be four chords up there. There'll be G, G sharp diminished, A minor, and D7. And it's like, well, how do you put four chords on one note?
Right.
There's a couple different ways. All of them are ugly, and all of them have ramifications. And it's just really,
Mm.
it's
Mm.
really kind of frustrating that at this point nobody said, okay, here's how we define a syntax for that, and that's going to be compatible with all the tools.
Mm.
Is
You,
the parent
So,
standard being maintained at all? I mean, the kinds of things that you guys are down and dirty, maybe elegant if you're lucky, adding. Does this get folded into some normative statement,
no.
or is
yeah,
everything?
No. To everything is
yeah,
basically we're at 2.1 and a lot of the
yeah,
2.2 stuff is in not there.
yeah. And it's kind of it's there's no actual formal committee or anything. It's just a bunch of people, or not a bunch, a couple people made tools, and
It's all de
and
facto.
that's it, and like, as I said, I really wanted to have, like, well, could we have like 10 people, 3 tool makers and 7, power users, and just kind of like, just talk, get this, and like actually move that standard document forward, because the standard document just pretty much, I mean, it's been languishing.
Yeah.
But it also makes, I mean, I kind of feel like ABC does a really good job for Irish music. And as you get, you've been torturing it and it's actually worked, but you would not want to read the ABC that you output, for those classical stuff.
Oh
It's
God,
just
no, no,
jumble.
none of that stuff's for
Yeah.
human consumption. I mean,
Yeah.
especially like when I do like tablature or
Yeah.
shape note generation using
Yeah.
bang notations. Yeah, none of that is for human consumption. That's just for
Yeah.
producing
Yeah.
result.
But for some people, like, the ABC needs to be human readable.
Yeah.
And so that's going to be a limitation about what you can do with it. And that's a valid case. I mean, really, like, the whole point of it is want to be able to write it on a bar napkin.
But every time a big name Irish musician, Mary Bergin, the
Yeah.
queen of tin whistlers, 10 years after having claimed that it existed, has finally released volume 3 of her 3-volume tutorial statement of here's how I play the tin whistle. And she uses staff notation in parallel with ABC, staff notation modified as she thinks it ought to be to serve her purposes,
Yeah.
and a major effort for anyone who's conversant with staff notation to understand not just what she's doing, but why did she even bother making the modifications in
Yeah.
parallel with ABC, about
Yeah.
which the exact same thing can be said. Some
Yeah.
other guy publishes a book on how I play the fiddle, and I mean, this guy knows how to play the fiddle, but he sure doesn't know how to describe what it is that he is doing in terms that a reasonably literal musician in any context, using any kind of notation, would be able to understand without having to. I mean, there's a
It's
Rosetta
so
Stone
hard.
that's just missing
Yeah,
here,
Yeah.
but there's an
it's
ABC standard.
it's so hard.
Has that always been de facto, or has there ever been any kind of
It's
Well,
always been de
industrial?
facto, more or less.
but I mean, there are things written down. So I'd say there's some of it is standardized. But so one of the most common requests I get are like, having it so that if you put an accidental on a note, the accidental doesn't follow through to the end of the measure. Like, I played E flat, and then I put an E flat there, and then I put an E, but that second E sounded like E flat. That's a bug. It's like, no, it's not.
No,
That's how
it's not.
music works. But I mean, that's one of the most common things, which goes to your point of, like, that's not, like, people want music to work a different way. And it's like, well, I'm not so much expressing ABC as I'm creating sheet music. And hopefully there's a close to one-to-one, correspondence, but it's not absolutely one-to-one because of the things you said. Like, people have created things in ABC that are not real music. Like, there's another thing, I haven't seen this for a while, but like 10 years ago or so, a couple of people wanted, it's like, you put 2 dots and that means you repeat, 2 dots bar line.
Oh yeah.
And that means you repeat, it's like, that's a standard repeat sign. Well, what if you do 2 sets of those? Well, that means you repeat it twice. It's like, that's not a real thing.
Yeah, but it's in yeah, I've seen that used in the standard. I've seen that stuff.
No, but I've never ever seen that in real life,
Real life, yeah.
except somebody asked for it. Two different people asked for it, maybe 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that's not sheet music.
Yeah.
That doesn't, that's not something I'm interested in doing, because
well, this is one of the things that, it's to Carrie's point, is like, ABC itself, you can in terms of just the visible representation of the music, and again, we're not talking about the playback side of it, is very rich and can do a very good job of representing I've done a lot of transcribing of musicians for their events, particularly John Whalen in particular, of transcribing his accordion stuff for his online events. And I found ABC to be a very, very nice way to do that. The bigger problem is, if you look at the actual there's kind of two different documents out there that there's the ABC 2.1 spec that I link to in my tool, and that is very common, and abcjs pretty much matches that in terms of implementation. I find myself continuously going back to that and finding things I didn't like. Like the voice octave versus transpose stuff for doing visual versus audio transposing was just like a miracle for certain people and certain markets, instruments that I support. But the problem is when you start to look in that spec and you start to look where things get really fuzzy, and where I had to do a lot of experimentation, and there's a lot of inconsistency across the board, is in the implementation of the MIDI extensions to ABC. Like just yesterday, I got somebody who on Facebook was using I think it's the WordPress plugin for abcjs, and just wanted to like change the sound, and he was using a form of the MIDI program change that I never seen before. Maybe it came out of some ABC 2.2, or you'll see these really strange ways of representing voice to MIDI. And and of course I just use the standard % MIDI program, and that's what I use 100% of the time. Every so often you'll see these these other older style representations that go back to I don't know what tool, right? And then there's this whole vocabulary of MIDI extensions that are there's a book out that's a PDF that's out there. It's actually a book on like making music with ABC 2.2 or something that just has all of these MIDI extensions. There must be 50 of them. And some of them are in abcjs and some of them aren't, right?
Yeah.
And
the thing, that's just mainly because I haven't had time. Like I'd love to support as many as some that make possible. Some of them don't make sense.
No, some of them don't make sense. That's the problem.
But so you pick what you can, like, and like the visual things in particular, some things don't make sense. Like when you're on the web, like you style things with CSS. And there's a lot of places where there's specific style things that are put right in the ABC, and that's not the right place for them. It's like, you want to, and so there's some things like that that I don't really want to do from the ABC, because that's just not the way it's done. It might be the way you did it, on your own computer or something, but there's things like that. And there's all kinds of things that are apply to print, but don't really apply to what you see in a web page. And so, but that's the thing. It's like there's a lot of stuff that I would have loved to have gone through a standard process and be able to have people, everybody comes from their own perspective, their own tools. How does this particular thing work or not work? And can we come up before you implement it? Come up with an idea of what would be good.
All would be very useful, I think, on the web page would be just a list of put all. I mean, again, this isn't about trying to change it, but just put a list of like all of the common MIDI variants that are out there. And just a matrix that just says, MIDI program, yes. MIDI chord prog, yes. Voice program equals V MIDI, no. And just kind of a compendium, because that's where I found that there were a lot of features in abcjs that I didn't know were there in terms of the MIDI implementation until I tried them, or until as I got more confident working in the code, actually looking at your parser and saying, oh, look at that. He actually does support, this particular feature. And then I could use that to either I had done some crazy workaround where I didn't realize there was a solution, but just a compatibility matrix that says, here's the current implementation of what's supported in abcjs as far as the MIDI commands, and maybe list the common one, some of these common ones that maybe came out of old versions of, I don't know, ABC, whatever program. And so the people know, because I do get a fair bit of that where it's like someone sends me something and says it's not working or it's not the voice, and I'm like, oh yeah, this is that old style, and I have to send it back to them with the equivalent that works in abcjs. That could be very, very helpful.
Yeah, but actually, if you tell me, like, when that happens and somebody says, well, hey, this looks like a MIDI command, why didn't it work? Like, let me know, because maybe I can implement that. Because a lot of these are simple to implement. I just haven't had a request for it and hadn't really come across. And then sometimes I don't even know they exist. Like, sometimes somebody, like for instance, like you're going through and you're creating your own commands for your own stuff. Well, like Jeff Moyne is doing that too. And I don't know that he's doing that. And all of a sudden somebody will write to me and say, why doesn't this work? I was like, I've never heard of that before in my life, It's like, I mean, so those are just kind of like a lot of the problems with not having anything standardized.
Yeah. And I didn't want to, like, some of my things overlap with things that I know were supported sort of in 2.2, but I looked at it and I thought, if I were to actually like support the actual, if I were to add the support for that particular, well, of course this has been me learning how to work with the ABCS source code, ABCS source code, but I looked and I thought, I'm not willing to take on the commitment of implementing this thing that's in the standard in a generalized way. So I've kind of made the decision that I'm going to, for these things that I'm not willing to take responsibility for, that I do them as these custom things that work in my tool but look like comments to everything else. So the idea being to do no harm. So, if you run this thing on, some other tool, okay, the roles sound very generic, but if you run it on mine, it knows how to use the roles. That's been kind of my philosophy is, because of the lack of coordination and standards, I thought, well, these ABCs will work fine. When they're generated in my tool and consumed in my tool, they'll sound great. And then if they're generated in my tool and played in some other tool, they'll still work. They won't crash, but they won't have the enhancements that I've added to mine. Yeah, it would be nice to have a little bit more. It would be nice to have some kind of coordination on this stuff going forward, because I feel like it's sort of diverging a little bit. Again, again, coming from a do no harm thing, it allows me to at least be transparent, but it doesn't really extend. It doesn't raise the level for all, for all other things. It sort of keeps people in my thing, and I don't necessarily want that to be the case.
Does ABC come anywhere near industrial interests anywhere? I mean, is there some force that could be mobilized to turn this into a mandated standard?
Oh God, I don't think so.
So what's interesting is when I first created the WordPress plugin, and there's like what is it, WP Tavern or something? I can't remember what that is. Like it goes through and it finds does little articles on the finds plugins and talks about them, and they found the abcjs plugin, and they wrote about it and said, oh, this is really cool stuff. It's very niche or something like that. And I'm like saying, wait, what? It's like, yeah, I guess there's not that many people who actually put music on in a browser. Like that's it's a small market. But
what about shifting to the MIDI level then? And I remember when MIDI came along, and I worked with a guy who was actually an industrial spy who went to a music store when the DX7 appeared, bought one, plucked out the intelligence, disassembled it, put the whatever the prom was that he had pulled out back into the thing, returned it to the music store, couldn't tell that he had even moved a screw. And then he took that intelligence and started making little MIDI modules that you could put in accordions. So any accordion could be transformed into a MIDI compatible device. And that code was conceived presumably in conversations exactly like the present one. So if all that the ABC is just a meta representation of MIDI primitives, can we? I mean, there's just got to be some basis for everybody using this stuff in concordant manners, a reference standard or whatever. I mean,
Paul,
or is this just somebody? All I'm doing is revealing how little I understand about the way this
I'm
actually
curious
works.
though, is the level you know, for example, like I've been playing around with Music XML. You know, use Music XML seems like a more rich representation, you know, of which ABC is the subset. Is I don't really know anything about the Music XML standard. Is that actually a maintained standard? Is there some kind of thing there, or is that also ad hoc?
Well, Michael Good created it. I don't know, like I feel like that's a little bit more what do you call it? Orderly. But I don't really know a lot about it. But it definitely doesn't have the drama that the ABC standard has. So, um,
Yeah.
Drama in terms of the turmoil that it's capable of creating,
yeah,
or
yeah, right. Yeah, well, just I mean the
Focus
like
is it's at a different. Well, the thing is, it's the thing about Music XML is that it's actively used by some very large commercial products like MuseScore. You know that they've
yeah,
got. You know, so they've got
yeah,
every interest in having it be stable and
yeah.
extensible, and you know they're
So
building their whole company
yeah.
around it.
But so there's people like the guy who a guy who works with MuseScore a lot was actually on the ABC list, and he was really trying to push for a standard for ABC because he wanted to have an ABC import and export. It's like, well, to do that, you need to know what's correct, you know. And he was just getting really frustrated by like, not being able to say, well, in this situation, what is it supposed to output? And so I mean, I think that was kind of that's kind of been an issue with that. But so with the Music XML, I think it's kind of there's one person who controls what that means, and so that's pretty solid. And it doesn't do everything perfectly. And there's another one, MEI. I don't know if you've ever heard of that standard, music something interface. But that was kind of a small thing, and it was sort of it was it was people who didn't like the Music XML. Still an XML standard, but it does things differently. And one of the things is those people were more scholarly, so they wanted to have variations in line. Like for instance, well, we found this Schubert thing, and he scratched out these two measures and put these other two measures in. And so we want to be able to express music that has all of that in that. We don't want to have two different versions of it. The first, we want to have one version, and these two measures, we have alternate things. And there was like all these ways to do that, saying this is an alternate. And so, but they were doing a different kind of thing. And so instead of using Music XML and extending it, they just created their own. So it was a different kind of thing. And I don't know how much it's used, but I do know a few people who are doing very PhD level analysis of stuff use it, and it works great for them. But yeah.
Back in the 50s, Pete Seeger produced an album with sleeve notes for folkways, the folk singer's guitar guide. And Erwin Silber transformed it into a book. And I think right at the start, the opening is, ever since people first started writing music, people have been trying to figure out ways of getting out of having to learn how to write music.
Right, exactly.
And here,
Yeah.
how many millennia later?
Yeah. Well, I saw this great YouTube video that was so funny about how, sheet music sucks, or I can't remember what it was, but this guy who well, he's like one of the contributors to Audacity, for instance. He does a lot of different things, but he sort of goes tongue in cheek about how, look how terrible this is, look how terrible. And then by the end of it, you realize why everything is like it is. It's kind of like, and then he does talk about all the alternate forms, alternate things that people have come up with, and he talked about, like we talked about piano roll. Like I'm trying to look at exactly how sound is arranged, there's nothing better than a piano roll for that. You know, just having like one line for each half step. And then this is the vertical line is exactly a timeline. And you can exactly see what's going on, but you could not sight read it. There's absolutely no way you would be able to ever get good enough to learn, you know, like, well, you see a G over here and there's all these lines and you see this spot here. Like, I mean, you know, that you just couldn't do it, but it's really good for analyzing what happened in a recording. And
Hmm.
so, you know, but that's the thing is there's different reasons you would use different things. So, but yeah, tablature is an interesting one because
Yeah. The most
sometimes, yeah,
Yeah,
sometimes it's like
But
just learn how to.
the most common request I have, and I was going to actually look at this, is I get requests from, like, I have a friend who's a bass player, and he does some really really nice bass. He's reverse engineering like all of these famous bass lines from the 70s and the 80s. I mean, just like micro. And I've had to make some changes to some representations in abcjs for slides and stuff to change. Like he wanted to be able to do slides up and slides. I'm sorry, slide in and slide out and sort of things. I've added some stuff for him. But you know, the one of the things I do get a lot from guitar players is like, I think we talked about this, is like the ability to, for a particular note, override the default tablature solution that's the lowest, you know, kind of lowest string, lowest fret thing, to be able to
Yeah,
say, use this fret on this string.
yeah. So
That's almost,
there's already a notation for that, and that's using the exclamation point and then a number exclamation point.
will it put it onto it? But how does that get reflected into the tablature on ABCJS, or is that just something
No,
that
that
just
I haven't implemented that yet, but
got
I'd
it?
like to because that's what's required for five-string banjo, for instance, to know
Yeah,
when you're hitting that fifth string.
yeah.
Um,
That's the most common
yeah,
request I get on
yeah,
tablature, is to have
yeah.
some.
And so, but there's already like, don't make up something for that because I think there's already a thing to do
Okay.
that. We just
Yeah.
have to implement it.
Yeah.
And
No, I was going to look at the I was going to look at the
yeah,
implementation. I figured there must be a thing.
yeah,
The
and
the other one that I'm interested in, is that, you know, browsers are now capable of doing both MIDI in and out hardware, and connecting to other virtual instruments and that kind of thing. I'm already doing, you know, MIDI input, so I can enter ABC from a keyboard. I can just play. You know, I can't do I don't do the timing, but I just get the letters in, and then you add the timing later. You know, for something like, you know, this, a warble, or one of those, you know, wind controllers. It would be very. I want to play around with actually sequencing out, flipping it around, and having it so that ABCJS doesn't necessarily can actually play out MIDI, and that would allow it to connect to virtual instruments outside the web browser. So rather than having to do your own font rendering and that sort of stuff, it would just become essentially a sequencer that would just send the events out of the browser to other devices.
mhm,
That's just something that when I get some time, I want to screw around with, because
yeah,
it's really really easy to do now,
mhm,
with the MIDI extensions for browsers. And because we're using it, you know, like for example, for the warble, this is a warble, we completely program this thing entirely on the web. I mean, you know, here's this, you know, it's a USB controller, and you plug it in, and all of the programming, both, you know, in and out, is all done just on a web page, which is remarkable to me that that's possible. And it was originally very limited to just Chrome, but now it works in Chrome, Firefox, and Safari. So,
mhm,
you know, there's some interesting possibilities there for extending the MIDI outside of the browser to
mhm.
for some
Yeah,
for some
yeah.
interesting
That
stuff.
requires like I can't really work on that because that requires hardware, so I'd have to go all in. Oh, I
No,
do have
no,
a
no, you
MIDI
don't.
piano.
No, you don't need hardware at all. You can run it, for example, on the Mac. I have my I have a bunch of apps that run on iOS, and they also run on the Mac. For example, you have these virtual instruments, like I have a thing called Celtic Sounds, which has about 6 or 7 different traditional instruments, and it just looks like a virtual MIDI module, and I can play it from I can play it from the browser without any hardware at all. So there's some, when I get something working demonstrable, I'll send you something. But I'm not,
Right.
I haven't even started on it yet. But I know it's
Yeah.
like it's something
Yeah.
that could be done in a couple of days, and it would be exceedingly cool. So
Right. Well, I have to run because I've
yeah,
got,
this has been
but
this has been really fascinating. I thank you so much, Paul, for willing to take the time to chat with us, and it's been it's been really interesting. And Carrie, I appreciate you the whole
yeah,
academic side of this thing
yeah,
and the analysis side of it. It's nice to know there's someone else out there who's thinking of it this way. I mean, honestly, things like rolls, the only way I was able to determine like what was going on in the rolls was by, recording myself playing and then looking at the waveforms in Adobe Audition and saying, oh, that's how much time I put on the cut, and that's how much space there is between the notes. This stuff is really, really hard. It's so
Uh,
subtle. It's so
just
subtle.
as a fun exercise, pick up Conal Grada's book on how to play the flute.
Yeah.
Nobody knows more about that than he from every single perspective. And he's got little snippets, and he says, under no circumstances does a grace note take time from anything other than the note to which it attaches. The notes are on the beat. Listen to this snippet, and then you slow down that snippet so that you can really hear. And here's the grace note, and there's the beat.
yeah,
Yeah.
Oh, I mean,
A lot of the, a lot of the, I honestly think a lot of this stuff, unless you actually record it and look at the waveforms, you won't actually know what's going on. I sure as heck didn't until I did it. What I thought I was doing and what actually happened
yeah.
were very, very different things.
Yeah,
Anyway,
no,
we
it's
should,
the other thing is the beat is kind of interesting because you think of a beat as being instantaneous, but it's not quite. In our like sound font, like the wood block, which is just a very sharp, that's 5 milliseconds. The loud part of that is 5 milliseconds wide. And so like your ear, like 5 milliseconds is instantaneous to your ear, basically. And if you put two wood blocks right next to each other, it's just a 10 millisecond wood block. Your ear, but it just takes more than that to like really say, and when you're playing with people aren't playing exactly the same time. There's just, there's the in the pocket and there's the kind, close enough. And so like the idea of what a beat is like, a little bit fuzzy too, so
ask an orchestral percussionist to
yeah.
explain their art. And
Oh
pretty
yeah,
much for every single one of the 35 percussive devices that they're using,
yeah,
they don't think in terms of the beat
yeah.
as much as when relative to where the perceptive beat comes, do I need to start up my
Yeah,
gong? And
Mhm.
yeah,
when do I thwap it if I want
yeah,
the people in the last row to hear it on
yeah,
what, for lack of a better term, is the beat? Thank you
yeah,
guys. I
yeah,
so appreciate what the
yeah.
two of you have
Yeah,
done.
the
And I'm just,
accordion is the same way. You have to like you start it. It takes a appreciable
Yeah.
amount of time for the air to build out. So you
actually,
start it before the
from
beat.
the strictly physical perspective, there are two kinds of musical instruments. There are the ones where you store energy that
Yeah,
is subsequently converted into sound.
yeah,
Push down a hammer on a piano, it
yeah,
thwops the string,
uh,
which then starts vibrating. And then there
yeah,
are the ones which are continuous transducers, bowed strings, wind instruments. You input mechanical energy that after a very brief delay is then continuously converted into
yeah,
acoustic energy. And
yeah,
man, does a lot of stuff depend on that
yeah.
nobody's thinking about. And it's kind of sad that the non-music readers, say in the Irish traditional musicians community, feel so defensive about how you can't understand music if you in any way consult a mechanical representation of it.
Well,
So I mean, they're just
I can tell you as a
Yeah,
Irish accordion player, you are exceedingly aware of that delay, especially on the
yeah,
basses, because they're such
yeah.
big reeds that you have to
yeah,
anticipate the
yeah.
beat, and you
Well,
actually
yeah,
play the left side of the instrument slightly ahead of where you play the right side of the instrument. Otherwise, it's very
Yeah.
hard to be in
Yeah.
sync. Yeah, it's
And,
a
and then you
endless,
play someone
endless.
else's accordion, and you got to get used to where that does it, because each accordion is a little bit different way
Right.
it builds up. Because yeah, I mean I have that problem all the time. Like I'll see a Cajun jam or something. Somebody hands me an accordion. It's like, oh, give me a second. I gotta
But
like
makes one wonder, yeah, how do pianists deal with it? I mean, there you have
yeah,
tremendous mechanical
yeah,
latency on top of
yeah,
the transduction that like I push my finger down, and after a
yeah,
while the hammer thwaps the string, and a while
yeah,
later than that somebody thinks he's playing exactly on the
yeah,
beat.
Yeah.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
yeah, no end to the problems to solve.
Oh,
Well, with that, why don't
okay.
we go ahead and we'll close up for the day. I really again appreciate both of you being here, and this has been really interesting and fun. So
Yeah,
And on
yeah.
behalf of the user community, unauthorized though the statement is, you guys are just, it's just amazing what you've contributed. And I'm
Oh,
just
great. Thank
reveling
you.
in any catalytic effect I might have had in your dialogue. So,
yeah. Well,
Yeah.
thank you, Carrie.
No. Yeah. Good. Thanks.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. Take care,
okay.
guys.
All right.
Take
Yeah.
care.
See ya.
Bye-bye.
See you next time. Bye bye.
Yeah.